In Roman history, few figures have stirred as much debate and intrigue as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, better known as Elagabalus. At just 14, this Syrian lad took the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He brought along religious practices and personal habits that would astonish even the most worldly Romans. His 4-year reign shook the very foundations of Roman society, challenging politics, traditions, and religion. Elagabalus's story isn't just one of excess or youthful mistakes. It marks a clash of cultures, East versus West, long-standing Roman customs versus foreign beliefs, and traditional gender roles against bold self-expression. His reign revealed the cracks in Roman society and played a part in the larger issues that would trouble the empire throughout the 3rd century. To grasp the significance of what Elagabalus represented, we need to understand his era. The early 3rd century was a time of great change for Rome. Although the empire had reached its peak under Trajan, signs of trouble were starting to appear. Pressure from barbarian tribes, economic downturns, and political strife created an uneasy atmosphere. Elagabalus was born into the Severan dynasty, which brought African and Syrian influences to the top of Roman power. His great-great-uncle, Septimius Severus, had established this dynasty through military strength, and his successors relied heavily on the army for legitimacy. This military connection is key to understanding how a teenage Syrian priest could assume the role of emperor. Syria itself was a land rich with ancient civilizations and diverse religions. For centuries, it had served as a crossroads where Greek, Persian, Roman, and Semitic cultures intertwined. The religious traditions from this area predate Rome, reaching back to the dawn of civilization. The sun god Elagabal, whom Elagabalus would serve as priest, was one of these ancient figures. Worship of Elagabal revolved around a sacred black stone, thought to be a meteorite, housed in an impressive temple in Emesa. This deity represented the sun, fertility, and divine kingship, with rituals that included music, dance, and elaborate ceremonies. The Romans would have found it strange that the priests of Elagabalus had such great power in Syrian society. They weren't just involved in religion, they had political roles too. Julia Domna, the Syrian empress and wife of Septimius Severus, brought these Eastern influences right into the center of Roman authority. Her sister Julia Maesa, along with her nieces, Julia Soemias and Julia Mamaea, carried on this legacy, wielding more influence than most Roman women of their time. This tight network of powerful Syrian women played a major role in Elagabalus's rise to power. The story began with the assassination of Caracalla in 217 AD. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect behind that assassination, took control but couldn't win over the loyalty of the Eastern legions. The Syrian women in the imperial family saw a chance and started plotting. Julia Maesa, who had been exiled by Macrinus, carefully orchestrated a conspiracy. She spread a rumor that her grandson, Elagabalus, was actually the illegitimate son of the popular emperor Caracalla. Whether true or not, this claim gave them the legitimacy they needed to challenge Macrinus. Elagabalus, with his striking look and exotic charm, became the face of a rebellion that would shake the empire. The revolt kicked off in May 218 AD at a legionary camp near Emesa. Julia Maesa had bribed key officers and soldiers, promising them bonuses and pay hikes. When Elagabalus showed up in purple, claiming to be Caracalla's son, the soldiers declared him emperor. News of the young emperor's lineage and generous offers spread quickly through the eastern provinces, fueling the rebellion. Caught off guard, Macrinus tried to crush the uprising with force, but his troops were decisively beaten at the Battle of Antioch in June 218 AD. The emperor, who believed he was safe, saw his support vanish as legions rallied around the teenage claimant. Macrinus fled toward Rome, but was captured and executed before he could make it to the capital. The win at Antioch made Elagabalus, at just 14 years old, the ruler of the Roman Empire. But the real power belonged to his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and his mother, Julia Soemias, who had engineered his ascent. They knew that holding on to power would be the next challenge. Managing the army and the Senate was no small feat. But what they didn't expect was that their young puppet would carve out his own path. The trip from Syria to Rome took over a year, and during that time, Elagabalus was busy building his power and showing his true self. Unlike other boy emperors who let others call the shots, Elagabalus was determined to take charge. His first moves, he got rid of supporters of the previous emperor and filled key positions with his own allies. While this transition was happening, troubling news started trickling into Rome. People were talking about the new emperor's odd behavior, his strange religious practices, his unconventional look, and his ambitious plans to change Roman religion altogether. Traditional Romans, already wary of foreign influences, started worrying about what this Syrian priest emperor would mean for their city. When Elagabalus entered Rome in 219, it marked the start of one of the most controversial reigns in Roman history. He didn't arrive as a typical Roman general celebrating a victory, but instead as an Eastern ruler decked out in the luxury of Syrian royalty. His look shocked the Romans: silk robes, elaborate makeup, and jewelry that Roman men would never wear. But what really alarmed them was what he brought along: the sacred black stone of Elagabal. This meteorite, brought from Emesa, was meant to be placed in a new temple on the Palatine Hill. For Romans, this was a groundbreaking religious change. They had never seen a foreign god take such a prominent role in their empire. Elagabalus pushed further than just adding another deity to the mix. He declared Elagabal as the top god, even greater than Jupiter himself. He insisted that traditional Roman gods now played second fiddle to this Syrian solar god. Elagabalus even took on the role of the god's high priest, performing daily rituals that many Romans found strange and unsettling. These rituals included sacred music, ecstatic dancing, and elaborate processions that became a normal sight in the capital. Elagabalus took part in these ceremonies, dressed in priestly garb with flowing robes and a jeweled crown. To conservative Romans, these displays were shocking. This was a serious challenge to their religious customs. The sexual and gender aspects of these practices stirred up even more controversy. Worshipping Elagabal included fertility rituals and gender-fluid expressions that had deep roots in Syrian tradition, but they were completely unfamiliar to the Romans. Elagabalus himself took part in these rituals, donning feminine clothing and changing his mannerisms during certain ceremonies, which shocked Roman society. His personal life became a hot topic full of gossip and scandal. His marriage to Julia Paula, a noblewoman from Rome, barely lasted a year before he divorced her to marry Aquilia Sava, a Vestal virgin. This was a huge deal, since Vestal virgins were dedicated to the goddess Vesta and promised to remain chaste. His second marriage was seen as a grave offense against Roman religious law. Even more outrageous to the Romans were Elagabalus's relationships with men. Historical accounts, especially from Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, mention his marriages to male partners, including a charioteer named Heracles and an athlete named Zoticus. These unions were celebrated like any marriage, with Elagabalus taking on the role of the wife. His gender expression became openly fluid and controversial. He wore wigs, makeup, and women's clothing, and even wanted to be called Empress instead of Emperor. Some sources claim he looked for medical procedures to change his physical form, offering big rewards to any doctor who could help him become a woman. While the truth of these details is debated, they highlight just how unsettling his behavior was. The political fallout from these personal and religious shifts was huge. The Roman Senate, already distrustful of Eastern influences, found itself compelled to take part in rituals they viewed as shameful and foreign. Senators had to attend ceremonies and witness practices that clashed with their ideas of Roman decency. Elagabalus's blatant disregard for Roman military traditions was just as troubling. Previous emperors at least pretended to have martial valor, but Elagabalus showed little of that. Elagabalus showed little interest in military matters, aside from keeping the Praetorian Guard loyal with generous gifts. He made appearances at military events dressed in Eastern styles, but he didn't care much for frontier campaigns. Instead, he appointed civilian priests to military roles, which didn't sit well with the military officers. Under his rule, economic policies reflected the extravagance of the Syrian court and his disconnect from Roman financial realities. Huge spending on religious ceremonies, lavish gifts to his favorites, and the building of new temples put a strain on the imperial treasury. Gone were the traditional Roman values of frugality and restraint. Instead, he embraced Eastern ideals of royal grandeur. His court turned into a stage for excess, shocking many Romans. Elaborate banquets featured exotic foods and entertainment that Romans deemed perverse, with levels of luxury that even surpassed the infamous extravagance of Caligula and Nero. The emperor himself changed costumes multiple times at these events. Palace intrigue hit new heights as various groups vied for the young emperor's favor. Syrian courtiers, Roman senators trying to stay relevant, military leaders, and religious figures all scrambled for influence. Even members of the emperor's own family had to tread carefully, balancing support for his agenda with their own ambitions. The imperial palace itself transformed into a sort of Syrian temple complex, marking a cultural shift that Elagabalus championed. Traditional Roman architecture was replaced or embellished with Eastern designs. The sacred stone of Elagabal was placed in a grand shrine that loomed over the palace. Daily life at the palace revolved around religious rituals that took up more and more time and resources. Multiple ceremonies happened every day, requiring the emperor and his court to participate. These rituals could drag on for hours and included practices that many Romans found exhausting and pointless. The emperor insisted on leading every ceremony himself, which often interrupted or delayed state affairs. The pressure on those forced to take part in these rituals was immense. Senators and officials were forced to witness and sometimes take part in rituals that clashed with their beliefs and societal norms. Some of them tried to adapt, viewing these demands as just part of doing diplomatic business. But others started thinking about rebellion. Foreign diplomats and visiting dignitaries faced the same ritual expectations, leading to international incidents that hurt Rome's reputation. Traditional allies didn't know how to react to an emperor who seemed more focused on religious ceremonies than running the state. Meanwhile, enemy nations began to see Rome as weak, distracted by internal struggles. The Roman people had mixed feelings about all these changes, and those feelings leaned more toward negativity. At first, some citizens were curious about the new Eastern practices, but soon enough, most grew frustrated with the interruptions to their own traditional festivals. The emperor's demand to change Roman celebrations to honor Elagabal sparked widespread anger among the public. The gladiatorial games, a favorite pastime, were altered to include religious elements that lost their appeal. Traditional beast hunts and combat shows were either replaced or turned into dull religious pageants that bored audiences. When the emperor showed up dressed in Eastern garb, the crowd's reactions grew more hostile. The economic effects of this reign started hitting everyday Romans hard. Increased taxes were needed to fund the emperor's religious projects and lavish court life. Merchants saw their businesses suffer because of the frequent religious holidays and ceremonies. Artisans were constantly pulled into making religious items and decorations for the endless events. Meanwhile, the military situation worsened as defenses on the borders were neglected in favor of court ceremonies. Reports of barbarian attacks increased, while the emperor remained fixated on religious matters. Veteran officers started questioning whether a leader more interested in rituals than military strategies could truly command Rome's legions. Provincial administration faced troubles too. Governors were pressured to enforce religious changes that local populations resisted. In some regions, especially in the western provinces, outright rebellion against the emperor's religious policies began to unfold. As the situation unfolded, the emperor typically responded by toughening penalties instead of tackling the real issues. The tipping point came when Elagabalus began meddling with traditional Roman marriage and family customs. His push for sexual practices that Romans deemed deviant sparked a social legitimacy crisis. When he tried to formalize these changes with legal reforms, opposition started to grow. Julia Maesa, the emperor's grandmother who had helped him gain power, saw that his reign was jeopardizing their family's future. Secret talks with military leaders and senators showed a rising agreement that a change was needed. The tricky part was finding a successor who could keep Syrian influence while ditching Elagabalus's most controversial ideas. They settled on Alexander, Elagabalus's cousin, as a potential replacement. He was younger, more adaptable, and importantly, not tied to the religious extremism that marked Elagabalus's rule. Julia Mesa worked quietly to gather support for a shift that would oust Elagabalus while keeping family control intact. The military's discontent was focused on the Praetorian Guard. Their loyalty, once bought with generous payments, was running thin. The emperor's negligence toward military customs, his preference for unqualified favorites in leadership roles, and his obvious lack of interest in military matters had turned even his allies against him. By early 222 AD, a conspiracy to end Elagabalus's reign was taking shape. Key players included his grandmother, leading senators, commanders from the guard, and some court officials, all fed up with the endless ceremonial demands. They needed to coordinate carefully to ensure a swift and decisive transition. Meanwhile, the emperor was becoming increasingly unstable. Historical accounts mention his bouts of paranoia, anger, and irrational actions, evidence that the pressures of leadership were weighing heavily on him. When faced with criticism, he usually responded by ramping up punishments and intensifying religious practices. The warning signs were all there. The crisis grew throughout the winter of 221 to 222 AD. The emperor faced increasing isolation from key supporters and failed to see how much his policies were opposed. This created a situation ripe for violent change. Even those closest to him started to pull away. Then came the assassination of Elagabalus on March 11, 222 AD. During what should have been a routine ceremony at the Praetorian camp, he was there with his cousin, Alexander Severus, to speak to the guards, completely unaware that it was all part of a carefully planned trap. When he arrived, he faced guards who had already chosen to support Alexander. What followed was chaos. Elagabalus tried to assert his authority, but his usual commanding presence had no effect on soldiers who were set on getting rid of him. His attempts to escape were useless. The conspirators had prepared for everything. The young emperor, once a figure of absolute power, was now powerless against those who had helped him rise. The killing was quick and brutal. Accounts from that time describe how the 18-year-old emperor was attacked by several assassins to ensure he had no chance of survival. His mother, Julia Soamius, who was with him at the camp, met the same end. The Syrian faction of their dynasty was wiped out in minutes. The way they disposed of the bodies sent a strong message. Instead of the traditional cremation and burial that Roman emperors usually received, they dragged their bodies through the streets of Rome and tossed them into the Tiber River. That treatment, reserved for common criminals and traitors, showed how history would view his rule. In the aftermath of the assassination, Elagabalus's religious and social reforms were quickly erased. The sacred stone of Elgabal was sent back to Syria. Temples dedicated to the Eastern deity were reverted to traditional Roman gods, and the ceremonial practices that had dominated the court were thrown aside. Alexander Severus, guided by his mother, Julia Mamaea, and grandmother, Julia Mesa, began to restore traditional values. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae on Elagabalus was extensive, but it didn't quite hit the mark. While official records were changed and inscriptions were modified, stories about his reign still lingered in history and in people's minds. The extreme nature of his actions guaranteed that he'd be remembered, even if it was just as a cautionary tale on how not to run Rome. Over time, views on Elagabalus have shifted quite a bit. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and those behind the Historia Augusta painted him as a depraved monster, suggesting his reign embodied everything wrong with Eastern influences on Roman culture. Medieval writers largely accepted this negative viewpoint, throwing in their own judgments about his sexual and religious practices. Today, modern scholars are making an effort to peel back the layers of bias and figure out the truth. Much of what we know about Elagabalus comes from sources that weren't exactly friendly towards him. Contemporary historians recognize that Roman writers often saw Eastern customs as corrupt and weak, making it tricky to judge Elagabalus's real contributions fairly. The question of his gender identity has particularly intrigued modern scholars. Some historians suggest that the ancient texts describe what we would now view as transgender identity, potentially making Elagabalus the first transgender ruler in history. Others argue that we should look at his behavior through the lens of Syrian religious customs rather than today's concepts of gender. The religious changes he tried to implement show early signs of the syncretistic religious experiments that would later become more common in the Roman Empire. His push for a supreme sun god foreshadowed some religious reforms that Constantine would later introduce. However, his methods and timing caused him to fail. The political lessons from Elagabalus's reign stretch beyond just religious and social issues. His story highlights the risks of a ruler being disconnected from the people they govern. No matter how strong a ruler seems, their power ultimately relies on the support of key social groups. When that support fades, even emperors can find themselves in trouble. The role of Syrian women was crucial in both his rise and his fall. Elagabalus shows us just how complicated power can be in the Roman Empire. Take Julia Maza, for example. She was willing to sacrifice her own grandson just to keep the family's power intact. That's how political strategy sometimes trumps family ties. The smooth changeover to Alexander's size? That was no coincidence. It was all planned to keep things running without too much fuss. However, when we look at Elagabalus's reign, it's clear he faced real challenges. He spent lavishly and ignored the need to protect the empire's borders, creating problems that his successors had to deal with. Rome had vast resources, sure, but they weren't endless. His careless spending had serious consequences. Then there's the military side of things. During his rule, the army became crucial in deciding who would take the throne next. While it looked like there were still traditional ways to choose a leader, true power lay with those who could win the army's loyalty. Elagabalus's neglect of the military? That was a fatal mistake for his regime. Culturally, his reign had effects that reached beyond politics. The clash between Eastern and Western ways showed the underlying tensions in the empire regarding identity and belonging. These issues would keep impacting Roman society long after he was gone. When we look back at how historians have discussed Elagabalus, we see important questions arise about the portrayal of figures who didn't fit traditional gender norms or sexual identities. Many ancient sources seem to exaggerate or twist his actions to make points about Eastern influences and what was considered proper Roman behavior. But recent digs in Syria, like those in Emesa, have shed new light. They suggest that what Elagabalus tried to bring to Rome wasn't as outlandish from a Syrian perspective. Instead, it might have been genuine religious practices instead of just personal quirks. The psychological aspects of Elagabalus's story intrigue many. Imagine a teenager with absolute power. Add to that the culture shock of moving from Syria to Rome. It created a situation that few people could handle successfully. When we think about Elagabalus, it's clear that how he acted might have been shaped by his personality and the culture around him. His legacy in popular culture has been heavily influenced by the wild stories from ancient times, shown in everything from Renaissance art to today's books and movies. He's often seen as a symbol of excess and decadence, but these portrayals usually say more about the times that created them than about the emperor himself. What's truly significant about his reign is how it highlights the Roman Empire's ability to change and adapt. Even though Elagabalus's ideas didn't catch on, the empire would eventually experience major shifts in religion and culture that were equally dramatic. His downfall might have been more about bad timing or poor strategy rather than an impossibility of change. In the end, Elagabalus's story is a stark reminder of how complex history can be and the risks that come with absolute power. Whether we see him as a misunderstood innovator, a troubled teen, or a representation of Eastern corruption, he remains one of history's most intriguing and debated figures. His short reign exposed the tensions in Roman society, which continued to affect the empire long after his dramatic end. The emperor who tried to reshape Rome in his image ended up as a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the need to understand those you wish to lead. His story still sparks conversations about power, identity, religion, and what historical truth really is. As Elagabalus attempted to remake Rome, he ended up ensuring his own downfall, leaving behind a historical enigma that fascinates and challenges scholars, even after more than 18 centuries.